All right, Chapter 3, Primordial Debts. So we've got two main ideas that have been put forward about money and its origins. The main hinge on which these ideas turn is what role the state has in generation of money. Both these ideas have some flaws, but they are worth exploring as alternatives to Graeber's myth of barter, if only because they offer something more in line with the historical record rather than thought experiment that leads to the outcomes that Adam Smith had in mind. First, we've got the credit slash state theory of money. For our purposes, purported by a British diplomat and historian A. Mitchell Enos, was previously involved in providing some evidence against Smith's theory about currency development, primarily because he was a diplomat to the Netherlands at about the same time salted cod was theoretically being used as currency, when in actuality they had a credit system being developed that he came back and said, no, your account's wrong, and here's why. So additionally, this school of thought was supported by the United States and Germany. Primary idea is that money is a unit of measurement, like an hour or a meter, and when you're holding a yardstick, you aren't holding a conceptual yard. When you're holding a dollar bill, same thing. You're holding a stand-in for debt. This position became known as chartalist for the Latin token charta. Additionally, in under a chartalist position, the form it takes doesn't matter. A gold coin is no more valuable than a dollar bill, except either for payment because you assume somebody else will take it for payment. Gold has no intrinsic value other than being assayable, and it doesn't tarnish. It's relatively easy to determine the value of a dollar. You just look at the dollar. But if being assayable or being able to tell how much of something there is and not tarnishing was what we really demanded out of our currency, being a commodity, we really would have switched to like a stainless steel standard at some point. So people denominated transactions in currencies of empires whose coins were no longer minted, and the coins were not exchanged, so your price is not necessarily related to your money supply. The most egregious example of this was Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire. The money system of shillings and pounds was used for accounting for something like 800 years after his empire fell, really reinforcing the idea that what we have here is a unit of account rather than money as a commodity. Money can be credit brought into being by private contracts. We could do business in beans if we really felt like it, but states dictate the terms. So if we do business in beans, but the state is going to assess a tax in pounds, we'd have to go the extra step of converting beans to pounds, which is something we have to do when bartering with strangers, but for everyday commerce, this seems unnecessary. So it leads us to a second important facet of money. You can pay your taxes with it, which means that states bring markets where we have these sorts of coinage arrangements into being by demanding a certain thing as tax and being in the position to specify what is and is not currency. Gold is only currency if it's stamped with Henry's face, for example. This is important because going back to Adam Smith, the idea is that the state and market are separate and in tension, and the government's role there is to secure the money supply by pegging it to precious metals. But the historical account really doesn't support that thesis. Another interesting side bit of money creation is army finance. In a simplified example, you've got a ruler who wants to support a large army. They issue a currency as a token, use it to pay their soldiers, and then demand that all taxes be paid at the end of the year in this new currency. You force everyone in your economy to do something that supports soldiers or to do something that supports people who support soldiers. States also create money as a facet of colonialism. You force a conquered population to pay you back your own money to force a cultural change, because if you're setting up plantations or railroads or whatever, only work that is paid in this denomination is going to be acceptable. So you have taken over a place, and with only the threat of violence, you can force a behavior change. This was seen in places in the Caribbean and Madagascar. An interesting aside, the Chinese discourses on salt and iron debate held in 80 BCE over the state monopoly and price controls versus the threat of private businesses rivaling the wealth of the state. The previous emperor had done something similar to the army creation idea, monopolizing what could be used as currency and nationalizing salt and iron production in order to support the conquest of tribal neighbors. And after his death, a debate was held on what were essentially market-oriented reforms and privatization, which echoes very similarly to debates we have right now at this point. So we're about 2,000 years too late. Another interesting aside that I really felt had to be included, even though it wasn't directly linked to the thesis chapters putting forward, but The Wizard of Oz as a popular retelling of debt and the desire of paper money versus the gold standard. Midwestern family farms such as Dorothy's, who have been facing a massive wave of foreclosure during the severe recession of the 1890s. The Wicked Witches of the East and West represented East and West Coast bankers, promoters of a tight money supply and the gold standard. The Scarecrow represented the farmers who didn't have the brains to avoid the debt trap. The Tin Woodman was the industrial proletariat who didn't have the heart to act in solidarity with farmers. And the Cowardly Lion represented the political class who didn't have the courage to intervene. The Yellow Brick Road, Silver Slippers, Emerald City, and Hapless Wizard are pretty self-explanatory, and the Wizard of OZ ounces being a denomination for gold is a little on the nose, but I felt like it was a fun little aside to include and something that didn't make it into the Hollywood retelling. Back onto our main point, Keynes, likely the most influential economist at this point, agreed with the historical count, but went even further and said that banks created money and could theoretically do it in unlimited amounts because at some point it would all sum to zero. All the money would have to be in some bank somewhere. But the real hinge here is taxes and the role of the state. So how exactly did early states come by the right to exact payments, which is a real weakness to state credit theorists? They have merely given an explanation for what the state could do, not what the state had the philosophical basis to do, which leads us into primordial debt theory. All of us are born owing something to the gods, society, the universe at large, etc. And the earliest kings and priests demanded tax or sacrifice based on this, standing in the form of the state for the debt that is owed to the universe. Primordial debt theory posits that to be born is to be guilty, and we pay interest on this debt with actions like paying our taxes, conducting appropriate rituals, honoring ancestors, etc. Consider the German word for guilt or debt, which is Schuld. It means the same thing. Also consider that things in Homeric Greece were valued in cattle or oxen, but never paid for in cattle or oxen. But you denominated this because you could offer oxen as a sacrifice at a temple. Gold and silver across the Mediterranean were similarly offered at temples. And so we see basis of currency not in the workings of any particular market, but based on what people would sacrifice in, or in a very primitive form, what people were taxed in. Another point in primordial debt theory, stateless societies have money but don't use it to pay for everyday things. It's almost always used to change relationships with people, to settle a feud, arrange a marriage, but you could never buy lunch with it, indicating that they don't think the purpose of money is for commerce. Classical Greeks looked upon direct taxes as tyrannical and avoided them whenever possible. Athenian citizens didn't pay direct taxes of any sort, and the city sometimes distributed money to its citizens directly or as proceeds from silver mines, or indirectly as generous fees for attending jury duty or the assembly. Another bit of evidence in support of the idea that the state is standing in for a primordial debt. Mesopotamian kings periodically declared clean slates, avoiding all commercial debts. They were able to do this because they represented the will of the gods in dealing with everyone. And essentially, this is what the state takes up currently when they ask us to pay taxes. They had to declare these clean slates because debt crises were periodic. A bad harvest would cause a large number of peasants to go into debt, unable to pay back their loans because things would be seized from them in order to pay off interest on that debt. So this is sort of where interest-bearing loans come into being, originally around 2400 BCE, used by the temples to finance trade caravans. they quickly turn into something more societally devastating. So overall, the theory doesn't work great as an origin for 2 points. How states have the right to demand tax because the modern state, with things like border controls and a cohesive society, only started to really exist in the last 200 years. So describing more ancient societies of having a debt to something called society doesn't make a lot of sense when the place in a place where you might only see government once a year, or might not even know what nation you're in if you're close to a border. So what primordial debt theorists have sort of done is back projected our current idea of a nation state onto more ancient societies. Additionally, it's difficult to make the jump from societal debts to commercial transactions. He points out that what I owe to my parents can never be repaid with money. Similarly, with those who left behind society, like great artists, people who developed the language, I can't Venmo a thanks for the Mona Lisa, but I could honor the legacy by becoming an artist. But this doesn't really translate directly into a currency. And this sort of ties back into stateless societies having money for relationships, but not for commerce. So we have examples of sacrificial items being used to value other things. X is worth so many oxen because the temple will accept it as a sacrifice, or the state will accept it as a tax. But how are these things valued in comparison to the infinite debt that they are supposed to be used to pay off? These things remain unclear, but it's valuable to define the questions we need to answer about how debt is arranged and how we make the jump from societal debts to commercial debts in the future. This is all also very macro level stuff, and we'll take a look at how to develop a theory of money and a theory of debt from a micro level in some future chapters. And as always, like, share, subscribe, make the sacrifices to the algorithm, comment and tell me that I have no idea what I'm talking about and this is all nonsense. Generally, whatever you feel you need to do to pay off your debt to society.